All right, we're live and we're rolling. Welcome back to The Real Venture, a fresh perspective on real estate, technology, and business trends for young entrepreneurs by young entrepreneurs. I'm your host, Peyton Truitt, joined as always by my co-host, Luke. Luke, how are we doing today?
Pretty good, Peyton. It's a blistery day here in Denver. I've been kind of just, having fun in life, not doing too much. What about you? What have you been up to?
You know, it's been a beautiful week here in Austin. It was 80 yesterday. Got to head out to the golf course, hit a couple balls.
Awesome.
It was a good time. Got a little sunburnt. You know, if you're watching
Man,
on the,
it's that sunny. I need to get down there.
I know we're waiting for you,
Yeah.
and then we can actually do this live in person, which would be pretty dope.
I don't have to sit in these freaking rooms and
instead of sitting in these rooms. Yeah, you guys, we're overcoming all kinds of technical challenges here, but the fun part about it is we're learning. If you ask us any questions about virtual meetings now, we're almost experts.
Experts. I'm still a novice. Peyton's an expert. I'm getting there.
We're getting there. We're bringing Luke along slowly. You know, he may be the smartest tech guy in the entire world, but when it comes to actual applications of media technology, including social media, he's not quite there yet. But we're gonna get him one day.
Social media. I'm getting there.
Especially social media. We gotta get the dude to repost our own clips. You know what I mean? We're getting there though. He's doing a much better job. So
thank you, Peyton. I appreciate the support.
So actually today's episode is just going to be Luke and I, and we're going to talk about an area that we think is pretty interesting, which is infrastructure. And the cool thing about infrastructure is there's a lot of different components of it. And I think, our third grade teachers would be really proud of us because we're actually going to start with a dictionary definition of what infrastructure is. And then we're just going to completely rip it apart and destroy it. So infrastructure is pretty much just the set of fundamental facilities and systems that support sustainable functionality of households and firms. So Luke, go ahead and let's start breaking that down.
Yeah. Just to give some color to why infrastructure is well for this episode. I think that kind of like the context and thinking about infrastructure from a technological perspective is super interesting, but mostly because it's one of the least, advanced parts of kind of the way that the current economy works.
Why do you mean it's not advanced?
Well, I think that a lot of the supporting functions and the reason that it's a slower and expensive thing to develop is because it's still very manual and it relies a lot on things like construction, which have kind of progressed less as it relates to technology and had less technological innovation. Enhance it. Worker productivity in construction has advanced less than any other industry's productivity as a result of technology. And I think that when you look at kind of both costs of infrastructure and the speed at which infrastructure projects are completed, it's very relevant to see that it's kind of something that's been neglected a bit from a technological perspective. But that's changing. There's lots of folks who have taken it upon themselves to get into that space and see what they can change. But I think that, from our perspective, it's something that is maybe not something we can do directly, but it is something that is interesting and it applies to things like real estate, which we're working on, as well as just kind of generally thinking about how technology can improve even industries like construction.
So I think, like you said, one of the most visible signs of infrastructure and construction coming together is going to be roads and bridge constructions, right? We see it every single day in our cities. We see it on the highway, but that's, infrastructure doesn't just stop there, right? It continues on. What are some other forms of infrastructure?
Yeah, and I think when you said the definition, kind of lends itself to a lot of different things, thinking about like what actually makes kind of like the core, the plumbing of a society, of a firm, of a household, whatever the case may be. And so that's things like education, law enforcement, even energy, dams, things that can kind of indirectly help a society kind of move forward on an energy front, on a personal and professional development front, and a security perspective.
And so when somebody says, oh, hey, this area doesn't have the infrastructure to support that, that is like a blanket statement, right? It could refer to the roads. It could refer to the school systems. It could refer to the emergency services, whatever the case may be. So, when you're out there and you're hearing somebody talk about infrastructure, we just want to drill in the fact that the roads might be perfectly fine.
Yeah.
And infrastructure, like we just said, is so broad. I mean, there could be a multitude of different reasons, or, more likely the case is the infrastructure and every single different component of it is mediocre, right? The roads are okay. The schools are okay. The law enforcement's okay. The government programs in the area, they're okay. But all of that in culmination together
Yeah.
equals poor infrastructure in some
I mean, it
cases.
really is, is it a sum of its part? Is it equal to the sum of its parts, greater than the sum of its parts? But in a lot of cases, it can be less than the sum of its parts. If you've got a bunch of average infrastructure kind of making up your society, it makes it really hard for you to kind of do anything. If you've got a 15-minute, 20-minute delay to do, to get to work because the roads aren't great. If you've got your kids not learning as much as they should because the schools aren't great, all of that kind of stuff kind of compounds and makes things a lot more negative. So when you look at something like the infrastructure bill, very little of it is necessarily roads and bridges and things like that. It's also, big portions of that bill have been set aside for things like universal pre-K, improved emergency response facilities and things like that. So, yes, like you said, very diverse, and it's something that is, super important.
So, yeah. So, like on those bills, it's, everybody zeroes in on the road. They're like, oh, this is a $4 billion road project. No, it's a $4 billion project that centers around the road, but also has a lot to do with the people and items that are going to be accessing that specific kind of infrastructure. And, I just got to ask a stupid question here, but like when you think of infrastructure, what do you think of? Like, what is that singular item that pops into your head? Because I bet it's different for everybody.
You think so? I mean, I think for me, infrastructure is roads, bridges, maybe just like that's the thing that's just ingrained in me from seeing people always working on stuff. You see money passed, it's for the roads, and you see all the people working on the roads. But yeah, I would say education, law enforcement, all that stuff was not on the top of my mind.
Yeah, no. And, I think that also stems back to, so my background was in supply chain management in undergrad. So intermodal transportation, I think, is one of the coolest things in the entire world. Like, right, a ship comes into the port. How many different forms of infrastructure does it travel on in order to get to your
Yeah.
front door? And, one of the areas of infrastructure that I'm just really interested in is railroad. And I think that, rail has kind of had its ups and downs over the course of American history, right? It was the item that connected the coasts back in the 1800s. It still moves the majority of our heavy freight, but there's also kind of a little bit of a resurgent of the idea of light rail, shorter distance, high speed trains. When it comes to infrastructure like that, what do you think is, what's going to come as a result of that? What's going to happen with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think rail's still going to be important, just mostly from the perspective that a lot of people need to get from a generic point A to a generic point B, and it's not really worth driving themselves or taking kind of individual forms of transportation. And so the idea that you can have this group transportation from one major population center to another makes a lot of sense, and I think that that'll stay around with things like Elon Musk's Boring Company doing hyperloops and stuff like that. There's one going up in Nevada right now or in Las Vegas that's under the strip. That's going to be pretty interesting. And so I think like that light rail, like you mentioned, will probably continue to grow. It's big in Asia and Europe. Not
And
so
I
much
think
here.
I think there's also some geographical ties to it, right? Like the East Coast, just from a historical standpoint, has always had a great rail system. The Amtrak's, the commuter trains. It's kind of just a way of life out there, right? If you want to get from Washington D.C. to Philly, you're very likely going to take a train, right? It's congested, the roads are packed. The train is probably the best option. But when you live in Indiana, like where I'm from, we pretty much just drive everywhere because it's flat and you just hop on a
Well,
singular
and you don't have
highway
enough
and
people,
you're there.
right? Like if you're like, let's take a train from West Lafayette to Indianapolis, like how many people are hopping on that every day? And you've got a ton of people going, but like still, if 50% of them are taking cars, it's probably not worth it for the train company to offer that route. And so I feel like keeping it in dense population centers, it's a great thing. I think with the kind of increased push in green energy, I think that it's a more fuel efficient way of getting people places, especially if you electrify it, which longer term seems like it's going to make a lot of sense. But I do think it requires a ton of upfront investment. And so if a private company is going to do it, they're going to need to see dollar signs somewhere. And if the government's going to do it, you've got to get all the people in Washington to agree on that. But
So that right there, let's talk about funding. So right now, these big public infrastructure projects, how are they funded?
Well, I mean, I think the number one way is public funding. That's where a lot of this comes from. It's something like 500 billion or so dollars a year is going towards just generic, broad infrastructure projects. And so that's coming from tax dollars. There is, though, quite a bit of research been done on the idea of the fact that we kind of have an infrastructure gap. So we've kind of underspent on infrastructure for a long time, and that has led us to kind of this point where um, even if we are to put in $1.2 trillion, which is kind of like the proposed number now, we'd still be quite a bit behind. The American Civil Engineering Society gave us a D plus on our infrastructure compared to a lot of other developed nations, which, that is, big negative, but it just means that we, as the, taxpayers, are the ones who are going to have to foot that bill unless we can think of more, creative ways of funding all that. But I'm not sure what thoughts you have of any other major
Well,
infrastructure.
first off, let's break down that gap. Like, why did that gap form in America, unlike other places?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more of an emphasis on the other programs rather than a lack of emphasis on infrastructure. So, like, I think that the infrastructure is not something that's sexy, and it's generally speaking not something that is put in the forefront, especially in good economic periods. And we've had mostly good economic periods. Last time we made a major infrastructure bill was during the Great Recession, and before that, it had been a long time since we'd really put emphasis on it from a policymaking perspective. And
Well,
you know,
that makes sense. I mean, like when it's, times are good, money's flowing, why would we take the time to fix roads and rails and all of this infrastructure that works, quote unquote, works at
yeah,
this moment when we could spend it on, different social issues or, national defense, whatever the case may be, whatever, the big political item is at the time. I can totally see how infrastructure can kind of get swept under the rug.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this leads into a bigger problem that I think our country is going to face here as we grow up. But the idea that most of our budget is going towards Social Security, Medicare, and defense, like that's where most of the money that we're paying in taxes is going to, especially as our population ages, and it's like, okay, there's even less taxpayers and more people that need this, so that number's going to grow, and the total tax money is going to shrink. Not to mention the $4 trillion that we spent in coronavirus period that we didn't have, and the ballooning national debt is all leading us kind of away from the idea that let's focus on infrastructure. Although infrastructure can be one of kind of like the best ways the government can spend money in a time like this, where you have a lot of people out of work. You have a government that's willing to spend money because all those people are out of work, and you can kind of use this combination of putting people back to work by spending public dollars to improve your country while revitalizing the economy. And I think that it makes for a really awesome policy decision, but people just have not been 100% committed to it. Though we'll see. It's going to keep getting pushed forward.
And it's not sexy. I mean, who wants to, inspire all these people to go back to work to help,
Build roads and
build roads,
bridges.
but you can always kind of flip it and, and this is a big, like, political, you can twist it very positively to be like, hey, let us help rebuild America by fixing our infrastructure. I think that there's another good example in history with the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA. That was a massive infrastructure project that, they dammed up the Tennessee River in a bunch of different spots. It brought power and, through dams to a lot of rural areas of Tennessee, but also it provided a ton of jobs that got a lot of people out of poverty, started to set up different ways of life for areas of our country that normally wouldn't have access to it. So like massive infrastructure projects like that are an incredible idea and something that's very lucrative, not only for the state or the government itself, but also for the people that are going to be working on it and then also benefiting from it in the end.
Yeah, no, I mean, it makes sense too, right? If you're going to give somebody $100 as either unemployment or to have them work for a couple of weeks building a road, at the end of the day, they're getting their money. And in one scenario, society gets a road. In the other scenario, you don't. And so I think that that is like the purely economic argument. I think that there's other issues with just kind of having people work for their money, and that's not always a solution. But it's definitely one that will be exciting if we do end up getting this multiple hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure funding. I think we'll see a lot of awesome things popping up. But that leaves out kind of the other major chunk of funding, which comes from private industry. So a lot of things, especially energy, but also railroads, some airport funding is coming from the private sector and companies or financiers that want to see either a return on that investment or use it to kind of further other investments that they may have.
Let's pause right here and break down kind of what we were talking about there. I mean, private funding is so attractive to so many different people for a couple of different reasons, right? When you're actually the financier, where you're providing the capital in this case, you're evaluating the project based on ROI, right? You know that if you build this road, this toll road, for example, X number of people are going to travel on it. It's going to generate X amount of revenue a year. Therefore, you're able to go to your investors and, this becomes a big rolling money snowball, right? Yep. Down the hill. But it's also attractive to the government because the government is not going to have to use its resources on that specific build, even though it's, kind of their responsibility in some cases, but, being able to outsource it to a private, group for fundraising is extremely lucrative to both parties.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the Chicago Skyway toll bridge is a great example of that. We talked about that earlier, but just the kind of the idea that you have a piece of land or a road or whatever the case may be that the government's going to have to pay a lot to maintain. It's obviously generating revenue for the government if they own it, but it does just create this extra thing that's on their balance sheet that they have to think about, and allowing a private company to just take it over so they can put it behind them has worked out well for Chicago so far. And it's like a 99-year lease. So clearly they're not going to have to think about that bridge for quite a while. But
no, that is some of the most secure forecasting that you will ever see is a 99-year lease. You can budget that for sure.
I actually saw it was pretty funny. So Yale's endowment has a bond from a Dutch water company from 1648 that is a perpetual bond. It's like 3.5 or 2.5% interest in perpetuity, and they still just collect money on it, which is crazy to me that it's still around.
Why did that happen in the first place?
Well, so they were funding an aqueduct. So Amsterdam's underwater.
Yep.
And so I think this was a part of the project to just kind of like continue to like dredge it and maybe it was making a canal or something, but I didn't really understand necessarily the purpose. The point of the thing I was reading was more that BL's got this like thing written in Dutch that's like, telling them that they have 2.5% interest forever. But so it's been in place for 350 years or something, which is just crazy to think about something being around that long, but 99 years now doesn't seem too long, but
no, the other area where privatized funding is kind of relevant and, pretty cool in relation to us, cause we like sports so much, is like funding sports stadiums, like LA's new stadium and Las Vegas's are both, I believe, 100% privatized money.
Yeah.
So it is an extremely lucrative, the city of Las Vegas, absolutely, they want that to happen because when there's a game or an event or the Final Four or whatever the case may be, people are going to flock to Vegas. They're going to gamble all night. They're going to drink. They're going to eat. They're going to stimulate the city, but they didn't have to pay a single dime for the actual reason that the people are there to come. I mean, you'd be out of your mind to not think that that's an attractive option.
I think that's an interesting point, and I think that that's happened in a few other relevant instances. I don't think there's a ton of private roads or things like that, but even like airports in similar things, there are a good bit of private investors who have taken an interest in getting involved in that over the probably the last 40, 50 years. And one of the metrics that is often cited with regard to how little the U.S. has spent on infrastructure is the percent share of GDP that we spend on infrastructure, and it's kind of steadily been declining kind of over the last like 10, 15 years. But maybe a big factor in that is the the privatized investment. And yes, we haven't spent enough, but privatized investment maybe made up some of that. And so, it's interesting.
Playing devil's advocate on this, why would the United States want to change any of this if people are just going to step up and pay themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, but I think I don't know who the hell is going to pay for, like a highway. Like, there's no money made on a highway, right? You know, who's unless you can
Unless it's a
start
toll.
charging tolls, right? And I think privatized roads are a super interesting idea. I love the idea of privatized roads, but I don't think that it's anything that's widely, accepted beyond like toll roads and like
Well, okay, so
interstates and things like that. So
let's think about that. So a lot of rail is privatized, right? It's owned by Union Pacific. It's owned
Amtrak,
by, yeah, exactly. And they charge a fee or a toll or whatever the correct word is in that industry for other trains to pass on their track. And what's really, cool is when this rail was laid so long ago, they claim some good routes, right? There are some passes through mountains, stuff like that, bridges, et cetera, that Union Pacific owns that everybody is going to have to use and everybody's going to have to pay. So I don't even know how that would happen in today's world. So if you wanted to connect two different highways, I mean, could we just go out there, finance a road and just build it and then
yeah,
literally
dude.
lock the gates until somebody pays?
That's I've actually wondered that as well, and just been like, what if you bought 20-mile stretch of land connected to major interstates that aren't connected right now, and can you
I
charge
mean,
a
for no
toll for
reason.
that?
I don't know why you would do that, but
Yeah, well, I mean, if it's something that you're like, oh, like the next way to turn around is not till Chicago, and
that's a
you're
good
gonna have
point.
to sit in traffic for a couple hours, right? And you can like, oh, I could just like jump over now and not worry about that. Like it might make sense to build something like that, and you're responsible for making it nice and all that stuff. But I have a feeling that if you were to have a road like that, the person who built that and is collecting a toll on it has a pretty strong incentive to keep
Keep it going.
yeah.
Okay, so two questions just popped into my mind from that.
Okay.
First one is going to be eminent domain. If we build this privatized road that connects two government roads, right? Two different major highways.
Mm-hmm.
If the government wanted to come through an eminent domain and take literally the exact middle parcel of land and completely disconnect our road, they could do that,
Yeah.
right? All they have to do is offer us market value, and we can break that down any further if you want. And then the second one is if it's a privatized road, are we completely liable for any injuries, deaths, anything bad that happens on our stretch of private road?
Yeah. I mean, so to answer the eminent domain one, I mean, I think that is definitely a risk. But do you think it's any
Because that
more
would
of a
suck.
yeah, I mean that would suck. But do you think that you would be able to price in kind of the value of the toll on that road and say, well, this is like present future value of this is like I don't know, a few $1 billion when maybe it's only generating like a couple $100 million, a couple $1 million, whatever it may be. Um, or do you think that you'd have to kind of do it at like, oh no, this like acre of land is
No, I mean
worth.
the government just has to offer you fair market value. So if
I,
you're if the land it's on, even though you have a $20 billion road, and I mean don't quote me on this because I'm not 100% sure, but to my understanding, if you have a $20 billion valued road, but
doesn't
you're
matter.
sitting on a $1 million parcel of land, I think the government just has to offer you $1 million for it,
Yeah,
and then
that's
boom, your
interesting.
road's
That would be
gone.
unfortunate if that was the answer, because I don't think anybody would build that. But don't you think that's true of like any private railroad? Why would any railroad company build a railroad?
That that is a great point, and I don't know.
I would
Maybe
assume
we
that
got to do some
there's
research.
more. Yeah, there's probably more to that. Well, everybody, we're going to do our research and come back to you with something. Then the other thing you would ask is about injuries. I mean, what is the case in like a public road? Like if somebody gets in a crash on a public road, is the government gets sued? Like what
I
happens?
don't know. Can you sue the city of Austin if you got injured on a stretch of I-35 in Travis County? I mean, I
I
don't know.
bet you could. When you were coming into Dallas, I was driving down there back in December, and that road, it was raining. That thing is pretty dangerous, that interstate. And then I saw on the news about a month ago, there was a huge pileup after that icy week in
Yep.
Texas. So I mean, like that kind of stuff. It's like okay, that's just like a poorly designed road. Like, can you sue the person who designed the road? I don't think
It's
you can
poor
sue the government,
infrastructure is
but
what it is.
poor exactly. Poor, we need more funding, but yeah, no, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think the more exciting one to me, I think definitely roads are exciting because I think that it'd be awesome to have more privatized roads. But I don't really know what that necessarily looks like as we've kind of landed on. But what about energy? I think energy is a really cool part of infrastructure that is Often ignored because energy is so cheap now. But with stuff like the Texas blackouts, like it's a little bit more relevant now. What is in your mind like kind of the phases to where government should be involved in the funding and support of energy infrastructure?
Well, so the events in Texas make me completely doubt my original statement because the Texas ERCOT,
Yeah.
ERCOT. Not 100% sure what it breaks down to in the acronym, but basically the Texas infrastructure or the Texas energy infrastructure is privatized and has been for a very long time. I believe like since like the 1930s. And obviously that's been a very lucrative venture for some people, as we've kind of mentioned and talked about the positive sides of privatized infrastructure. But it was designed to handle the typical Texas weather, as in really, really hot summers. Being from Indiana, Luke's from Minnesota. We're both from very cold places, albeit Luke's is much colder than mine. Our energy infrastructure is designed to handle that kind of weather. Our houses are, built in a way to, our pipes are insulated. Like we don't have to drip our faucets where we're from. But down here, people were freaking out. And as a result, the temperatures dipped, energy usage went up, and basically we were minutes from destroying our entire energy grid. And then that's where the rolling blackout started and things kind of rolled downhill. But one of the problems that everybody kind of went back to is everybody wanted to blame the government, but the government came back out and said, well, we don't run it. So it was kind of the first red flag that pops up. It's like, okay, well, like who's going to be held accountable in a situation like this if it's not the government?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that I was reading a good bit about that back when kind of that was all going on. I was like, wait, why is this happening? And the government came to the Texas power grid and said, hey guys, like you need to winterize your energy. That was like 2011 or something. And they kind of just like rolled their
Because
eyes.
there's a really
Like,
bad storm
whatever.
in 2011. That's kind
Yeah,
of
that was like the
like
first
what happened kind of happened. I'm not
like
sure
not quite like right
yeah.
like it was like it got to almost that point, but it didn't quite cause blackouts and that stuff, and so like it was scary. People were struggling, but nobody, I don't think anybody lost all their power or very little compared to this time. And then I think it happened again in 2014, and that was even worse. And they said, come on guys, you gotta winterize your stuff. And I think that they still ignore them. And so what's basically happened is interesting. The power grids everywhere but Texas are public. So the federal government has kind of a domain over like their maintenance and is responsible for making sure that it's good. There's still private companies that operate it and generate electricity and all that stuff. But the actual grid, the thing that connects all the houses to the power plants and all that stuff, is public. And so the federal government has a commission that goes around and like, determines what needs to be, made more secure and all that stuff. And so these states or these private companies have to comply, but Texas doesn't. And since Texas didn't have to comply, and it was sort of just more like a recommendation, the federal government had no way to say like, yo, you guys got to get that stuff winterized now. Otherwise, something bad's going to happen, and then something bad happens. So I think the interesting thing is one, what is going to happen to these private companies because of this? Like, is anything going to change? Are they going to winterize stuff at least now, or what? And then the other thing is like ERCOT like didn't really do its job either. They were supposed to be kind of a more regulatory agency, and they just kind of sat back and watched. And I think they profited a good bit from it as well. And it may just be more profiting in a political sense. But
Well, they had to like I'm going to make up a number and say that they had 12 board seats and 7 of them were people that were out of town and they all had to, out of state, right? 7 people that lived outside of Texas and they all had to resign, which kind of goes back to like the sense of urgency, right? Nobody really understood it unless they were in that situation. And that's kind of what happens when you privatize, because whoever owns, the biggest chunk of the company, whoever owns the most shares, they're the ones who sit on the board. That could be literally anybody from anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think it brings up an interesting point. I like the idea of very limited government and all that stuff in some sense, but I think the government is there for a very specific purpose at times. Like no matter kind of what you think, like the ability to handle crises and plan for crises is something that is like uniquely a skill that the government is supposed to have. Maybe they don't do it perfectly every time, but things like coronavirus, war, or in this case, extreme weather, are things that private companies aren't really meant to handle because it's not really something that directly impacts them until it does, and then they're not really prepared for it.
So did events like this, did this permanently taint privatized infrastructure, or what is privatized infrastructure going to look like going forward?
I just think, I mean, it's just going to, kind of put a heavier regulatory blanket over all of it, right? Like the privatized infrastructure part of this wasn't necessarily the problem. It was that the privatized infrastructure didn't have any incentive to, prepare for the future and prepare for bad, scenarios like this. And so, I mean, if I'm ERCOT or I'm the Texas government, I'm saying you guys can stay private, but you got to follow rules now, and we're going to set the rules for you that make sure that this doesn't happen again. And so I think that's the combination that is probably going to end up happening in Texas. And I think for a lot of these infrastructure projects, if we talk about roads being privatized, maybe the government does need to have you hit certain standards and things like that. Just like you do in, you're selling drugs or you're selling food, right? You still have to follow the rules that the government lays out. But I think we just got to do a better job of making sure we follow that.
Yeah. And, not to forget that there are so many rules that are within the actual building of the infrastructures, right? Think about all the rules and regulations that go into roads and bridges and, building codes and things like that. It just, everything, just has to kind of trickle up until it affects the whole system. But kind of moving in the opposite direction into the Wild West, where there's absolutely no regulation at all. Let's talk a little bit about crypto in this in this world.
Oh, yes.
Because, well, first off, we got a ton of really good feedback from our NFT conversation last week. So, we really appreciate all of that. And it was a really fun conversation to have. And it kind of opened up some new avenues that we weren't even thinking about, specifically like crowdfunding, which is literally exactly what we're about to talk about here. So, Luke, I know you're pretty passionate about crypto. So, yeah, exactly. See, he's hyped. So how does crypto fit with infrastructure?
I want to say kind of at the most, like kind of most surface level, I think there's a lot of ways it could be impactful, but I think that the most obvious and digestible one is the idea of fractional ownership, tokenized ownership of physical assets like infrastructure. So taking something that is physical, like a dam or a road, and finding a way to assign property rights to parts of that are digital and specific, unique to the person who owns them. And then they're tied back financially to the success of the project or failure. And I think that is like a very broad principle that's true for a lot of things. But in infrastructure, it's interesting because if you think about something like a subdivision's energy, right? So you've got maybe 100 families in a subdivision or something. Maybe I'm thinking of not a subdivision, but you have 100 families that need energy. And right now their option is to get it from the main power generation company, whether, it's like, any of these, maybe it's freaking Texas energy companies, and they don't really trust them after these blackouts. What they want to do is they want to find a way to get like maybe a solar farm set up. They're passionate about solar. They want to get something like that set up. What they can do.
And when you say this, you're referring to a very small subset, as in like a community, as in a neighborhood, not the entire state.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm saying that's exactly what I'm saying. And I'm saying it could be two people. It could be, 100,000. It could be 30 million people like Texas or whatever it is. Right. But the point is the scale doesn't matter as much as the kind of generalized essence of fractional ownership and fractional rights to revenue, so that when you set up something like a power grid, instantaneously, like if you set up, a solar farm, all the money that's generated from that by the, if we said there's 100 families, maybe 30 of them want to participate in this, but all 100 families get the power that comes from that. The money that's made from selling that energy to those other houses can be then distributed amongst those 30 people. And of course that's possible in kind of like a more convoluted traditional way of like, building it, setting up an LLC. And then after you set up an LLC, you've got to assign like all these like fractional ownership rights to all the members of the LLC, all your tax, all that stuff. Right now, it could be much, much more simple than that. And all of this, the money that needs to be used to fund that project can just be thrown into, one of these smart contracts that basically just works to allow everybody who is participating in this some equal share to the outcome of this construction. And maybe the construction's managed by kind of somebody appointed by the 30 people that are participating in it. But it can all be kind of taken care of automatically without risk of fraud, without risk of a lot of the other issues involving setting up a company and worrying about where money's flowing and all of this stuff.
So traditionally, if we wanted to build a road, we would probably take out a government bond, right? And
Yeah, or
it's
private.
going to be this very, very secure, right? We're going to get paid back our investment, but it's going to take a really long time. We're going to generate 1% of, 1% ROI kind of thing. So in a proposed situation like you just described with the fractional ownership, the ROI would come back much faster.
Well, the ROI comes back faster. You put less on the line from a like a debt perspective, but also you got to think about it. If you have 30 people in a 100-person community who are backing directly that project, their incentives are very aligned to
Yeah, because they benefit
responsibly
from it.
use it, to maintain it, to promote the use of it, all that stuff, right? So it does multiple things. It aligns incentives and it creates a more sustainable and safe funding route.
So if we wanted, we live in a community and we want to build a little league park. So we're gonna set this up right, and obviously it needs funding. We have to build the actual park. We have to maintain the facilities itself. How would we go about structuring it with an ICO through a smart contract? Like how, what is that thought process? And then also what kind of communication do you think has to happen with the government? The city council is going to have to approve our use of land, right? So there is going to be a little bit of government interaction, but ultimately at the end of the day though, we the people, right? Just to go back and, quote the Constitution, we're actually going to be the ones that are using it and paying
Yeah.
for it.
I think that the government, no matter what, and this is like the thing about crypto that's a little bit annoying is that a lot of the space is like very much, oh, like there's no government, like we can do whatever we want kind of thing. And I think that's going to change quite a bit once the government does start regulating it and understands what's going on. The OCC got very much involved in kind of the crypto world as of 2021. So, I think that slowly but surely it's going to become regulated in some capacity. But I
Mhm.
think you can't escape the government 100%. But this is probably the fastest way, or at least the least friction way, to go about doing this and least government intervention. And I think the other thing is, like you mentioned, like if you're getting the community to buy into something like a little league park, they're choosing something that they want to spend their money on, as opposed to paying taxes that they think are going to maybe go to something that they care about.
It,
Um,
it would be the most attractive option for people to pay the government because everybody gets mad that, oh, my tax money's going to this and I don't care about that. In this situation, you literally are paying for the one thing that you care about.
Exactly. And I think that there are flaws with the idea of that, just as there's like less sexy things that people can fund, like that need to be funded, like Medicare, for example. Like nobody's going to fund Medicare if they don't have to, unless they need it. But there is like a portion of your money, like especially infrastructure type stuff, that you might deserve some say in directly where it's going. And I think that people are willing to pay more money. There was a study done that I was listening to on a podcast a couple of days ago, but they basically said in one camp they were just like, okay, pay your taxes. How much more like would you pay if you could pay more in taxes? Like how much would you donate to the government, basically? And then in the other camp was like people that said, okay, everything that you donate, you get to pick where it goes. And the amount of money that people gave in both scenarios is like drastically different, right? The people who get to pick where their money goes are much more likely to give extra. And so maybe that's what this is it's just an extra way to give money back to your
Yeah,
community.
it's almost like a form of charity in a way that you're directing your hard-earned money into something that you really care about. So I just had an idea, and I hope nobody steals this. But basically, what I'm going to do now is I am going to fund through an ICO a golf course here in Austin, right? And so basically, everybody that would buy into it are people that live in the area and would benefit from it. But then the attractive thing is once it's all funded and it's laid out and it looks great, I mean, all of that money is just going to start flowing back in. So actually, but
Exactly.
now this kind of opens up my lack of understanding in this is how do I get paid back?
Yeah, so that has to do with what's called a smart contract, and so basically, what I mean at a high level, what's going to end up happening is that you go out to the golf course and you play around. When you play around that, yeah, I would say here to make it even more fun, you only pay with crypto to play. So you pay with crypto.
In the Tesla that I show up in my Tesla that I
That
bought
you
with
bought with
Bitcoin.
Bitcoin,
Yeah. Okay.
and it's powered by an Ethereum miner in Russia. But the general kind of premise would be that you go and you pay for your 18 holes. And as soon any payment registered, whether it's around concessions, whatever, is all getting locked up into this smart contract, which basically says if somebody pays me, what I'm going to end up doing is dividing that payment, that dollar amount, into a agreed upon format, probably stablecoin, DAI, USDC, whatever the case may be. And I'm going to divide that amount to like the most I can divide it to that we need to, right? Because these are things
and when you're saying divide, you mean breaking it down. I mean, there's payback and there's maintenance. And so it falls into like a crypto balance sheet where,
right? Yeah.
Okay. All right, gotcha.
And so essentially what will happen is that smart contract, there'll be some terms that you're agreeing to being paid on and paying out, the maintenance fees and the employment costs and all that stuff. But basically it's all going to kind of work in a cycle. Maybe it's instantaneous and you're paying out things as you need to pay them out and you're receiving income as you need to receive it. But it would all kind of happen as this like fluid process. Literally, you wouldn't need an accountant. You wouldn't need anybody to watch the books, because what this is it's code that says, if this happens, we're going to do this, and you can trust that, right? And you make sure you write the code right away. But once you write the code, then it's done, and it's just going to work the way you think it's going to work, and the money's going to go where it should. And so
no one's going to cook the books.
So nobody can cook the books, right? It's set in stone. Like that's the fundamental principle of these smart contracts, is that it is what you write it to be and nothing else. And so like you can't fake it.
And you couldn't like be a shady landlord and sneak in an expansion, right? Like you want to add a new 19th hole or something crazy. Like, no, like the smart contract's set up in the way it is, it's locked in. You can't do that until everything is satisfied.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you bring up kind of like my biggest problem with smart contracts and crypto right now, which is there's these things called oracles. I think we talked about this with maybe it was Krish, but you have to have an interface between the real world and the crypto world, and that's called an oracle. But the ability to kind of know what's going on in real space is important for being able to efficiently enforce a smart contract. And so until things like IoT and computer vision and things like that get a lot better, it's going to be really hard for smart contracts to be able to interpret real world things. So if you don't want somebody to build a 19th hole, you need to really, really accurately budget out what those 18 holes are going to cost, because then your smart contract can operate based on price, but it can't operate based on 19 or 18 holes because it's not going to know what that means.
Gotcha.
But eventually I think that will be the case. You know from a bird's eye view what that course should look like, right? Your smart contract can register once it looks like that. And, then it might be possible, but we're not at that point yet.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
Yeah, this is it's a fun conversation. I hope we keep talking about crypto, man.
Well, we always can talk about crypto, but most importantly, we also want to talk about what you guys want to hear more about.
Yes.
We've had a lot of people reach out, and which we appreciate. Like all this interaction on social media, it's far surpassed what we thought we were going to have, and things like that. So continue to reach out and tell us things that you're interested in. If something gets sparked by one of the conversations that we've been having, we've had 5 episodes up to this point, including this one, and we've talked about a whole bunch of different things. So if there's one area that you want to hear more about, let us know. Something that you want us to dive in a little bit deeper, maybe we continue this infrastructure and crypto conversation. You let us know. And then also, most importantly, if there's anybody specifically that you want to hear talk in this format, like a guest, fire them our way, and we'll do our best to reach out. We're learning the hard way that even though you're trying to do this, you still get rejected by people. So, but we're not afraid to send an email.
We haven't gotten rejected by anybody.
No, not really, but I'm sure we will very soon.
Perfectly. I'm just kidding.
100%.
But I'm excited. We got some fun guests lined up, I think. And the biggest thing is just figuring out more things that you guys want us to talk about, because we have a long list of things that we think are cool. But it doesn't mean you do. So, let us know.
Let us know. And then also, please, continue the conversation with us on social media. All of our handles will be down below in the description. But most importantly, follow, like, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, rate and review, follow on Spotify or whatever the verbiage is for that action, because all of that interaction really helps move the podcast forward. And like Luke just said, we have a bunch of good guests lined up, and we'll continue to break down these one-on-one conversations. So we got a lot of good material rolling forward for the rest of 2021.
2021, man. All right, everybody, keep it real.